Well, I think people have lost their fear of war, which is a huge mistake. That's number one. I'll give you an example of something I experienced back in 1995. I had been sent to Sarajevo, and I ended up driving all over Bosnia-Herzegovina. And after about 35 days, I was brought back to Dayton to help draw the maps for new boundaries for Bosnia-Herzegovina and Republika Srpska and so forth. In other words, how do you sort this child? And I remember sitting there talking to a Norwegian subsequently, and the Norwegian said something that the Americans were saying, that all sorts of people were saying. Well, these Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks, they all speak effectively the same language. There's no difference between these people. This is silly. They're all effectively the same people. And I looked at this man and I said, well, they don't think so. So they get a vote. And number two, by the way, is there any particular reason why Norway should exist? What is the difference between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark? Why aren't they all one country? That would certainly seem to make a lot of sense to me. Well, you could imagine it. Well, that's wrong. No, no, no. Norwegians are very different from the Swedes. Okay, fine. So the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosniaks are all the same, but Norwegians and Swedes are fundamentally different. This is the sort of, what's the right word, malignant stupidity that is widespread in Europe. The first thing is to learn a little humility, respect other people's views and what they think. Stop treating those things as though they are irrelevant. We do that all the time. You know, we went into Vietnam, didn't understand what was going on there. Nobody that went in militarily understood any of it. You know, during World War II, for instance, when we were bombing the living daylights out of Germany and Japan, Admiral Leahy, who's a little appreciated, unfortunately, he was the admiral who operated effectively as the senior military advisor for FDR. He'd been chief of naval operations. Uh, Roosevelt had known him for years when Roosevelt was the assistant secretary of the Navy. And he summoned during the war Arnold, who was chief of Army Air Forces and chief of all Army forces, Marshall, to the White House. And in the room, he had a private discussion. And he said, this is late 1943. He said, what are you doing in Germany and Japan? And they said, what do you mean, what are we doing? He said, don't you realize that you're destroying these countries? And after the war ends, we want to live with these people. You're making that impossible. And Arnold and Marshall were, what are you talking about? We were told to destroy Germany and Japan. So that's what we're doing. No thinking, no nuance. And it's not entirely their fault because they got no guidance from the highest levels. Roosevelt didn't think about it. So here's Leahy, who's trying to cross this chasm where there is no understanding, to get these generals to sit back and question what they're doing and try to think of, where do we want to be when the war ends? Now, just for your information, the British always understood what they wanted when the war ended: a bigger empire. And so whenever they had a conference with us in World War I or World War II, what was the focus? Enlarging the British Empire. So they looked for all the oil fields, all the ports, all the mineral deposits, all the mines. They had maps. They knew what they wanted when the war ended. They wanted to control all of these things. Now, my point is, we have nobody thinking in those terms. And I'm not advocating a war in which we should capture other people's mineral deposits or anything else. Quite the contrary. We have all that we need right here in Canada and the United States. Canada is very rich in rare earths and almost everything else you can think of. We ought to be doing a land office business with them. We have things in our country we haven't developed. My point is, there's no thinking. It's a huge lack of imagination, a failure of imagination. So everything's about destruction and total control. And that's not reasonable. It leads to disaster. And I think that's why we're on the road we are. But what do you do with a president like President Trump, who says, I support the mass murder and expulsion of millions of people from Gaza. And I don't care how many people are killed in Lebanon. And I don't particularly care how much of Syria Israel seizes and controls. And by the way, if they want to take the Sinai and move to the Suez, I'm not going to stop them. Well, Mr. President, you're in a lot of trouble then. Why are we involved in any of that? Doesn't make any sense at all. Our interests are not served by the Greater Israel Project. What are we interested in most of the world most of the time? Stability and prosperity. We want to do business. We want commerce. That's what we have historically been about. That's what we have historically done best. But we're not even interested in that anymore.
I think the unipolar moments might have made us lazy and ignoring strategy because under this we all became a bit like the British, well, in terms of maximizing only power. That is, the only source of stability is hegemony, and given that our hegemony is, advancing liberal democracy, it also makes it virtuous and all opposition essentially evil to be destroyed. So we don't really have. Yeah, much strategic thinking anymore. But just yeah, to finish off, circling back at the to the negotiations, do you see a diplomatic path or possibility to end this war? Because many people point out that Zelensky is in a very difficult spot. If he makes concessions, the nationalists or the fascists will have him killed. If he doesn't make concessions, Ukraine will be destroyed. And at the same time, what other concessions would the Russians be willing to make, given that they see this as an existential threat and they're, well, effectively winning this? So, is there actually a meeting point here, or does this war have to be finished on the battlefield? I know it sounds a bit crude and brutal, but how do you assess this situation?
Well, two things. Sometimes wars end when civil war breaks out in one of the nations. I mean, ultimately, we had a sudden peace in November 1918, and that was because of unrest inside Germany itself. And there was this concern that Germany could be destroyed if it did not end the war because of the social political unrest inside the country. I think that, frankly, you might see something like that in Ukraine, but tragically, so many millions of Ukrainians have left, and there aren't that many left for the size of the country. I don't know if that's even possible. So, normally I would think someone like Zelensky would be put out of business by his own country and replaced by someone else who understands now's the time to come to a solution and rescue the country. So that's one example. I'm trying to think of another way to look at this that would be helpful. And I think you've got to go all the way back to Eisenhower in the 50s. If Eisenhower were the president of the United States and your prime minister came and said, we agree with you, Russia is a terrible danger and Russia has to be stopped and so forth, Eisenhower would smile and say, well, Russia hasn't invaded, has it? Russia hasn't attacked you, has it? Is there any evidence that the Russians are planning to do so? And the answers, I think, would be no. And so then Eisenhower would say, if I were a Norwegian and I was bordering Russia, a nation of 140 million, and I only had 5 or 6 million Norwegians, I would try to find a way to get along with my neighbor. And that's one of the reasons that Eisenhower was a big advocate for neutrality. He was delighted when Austria became neutral because he kept saying to everyone who would listen on the military side, we can't defend everything. We can't afford it. We don't have the forces large enough to defend these places. So we should neutralize more countries. He would have been fundamentally opposed to the enlargement of NATO because he said, this is crazy. How can we defend Romania? How can we defend Bulgaria? How can we defend the Baltic littoral? We can't. I mean, that's sort of like waving a red flag in the face of your potential opponent. So you're right. There has to be some rationality, but we're dealing with media and political activists, lobbies that are there to pursue their agenda with our resources, our forces, all at the expense of our strategic interests. So you've got to defeat that at home, much like you've got to get rid of Zelensky and halt this war before any more territory is lost, which I think is now inevitable. But no one seems to know how to do it. I mean, right now, if you're sitting there in Moscow, you're the chief of the general staff. Where would you want to be when the war ended in Ukraine? I think I'd want to be on the Dnieper River line because that's a natural defensive position. That buys you some degree of security in a larger zone. Then you can debate whether or not it makes sense to take Odessa. I know the Russians would like to because historically it's not Ukrainian, it's Russian. But they may decide that's more trouble than it's worth. I don't know. I don't know what the thinking is. Kharkov is another one. How much? I think the Russians will insist on that. But again, I don't know exactly what's going on. But from a purely military standpoint, if I were advising as a general officer in the Russian military, I'd say, Mr. President, let's stop at the river line. Let's hold that. Make that the final limit of advance. If we still have problems, we can always cross it and march further west. But that would be my objective. And chances are very good that that could be accepted. That means the Russians, if they decide to pull back and give up some of it for some reason, can do so. I mean, quite frankly, they don't need to control all that territory, but what they do need to ensure is there are no Ukrainian or foreign forces on the east side of the river line, I suspect.
Well, I wish there was some revival of strategic thinking. Um,
Well, you're
to
teaching, you're a professor,
Yeah.
get out there and hammer this into people's heads. Tell people to put their emotions in check. That's our problem. Everything is emotion. Nothing, none of it's reason.
No, I agree. And at least in this country, they used to, during Cold War, to balance off deterrence with reassurance. So don't put, the American or British up in the north. But now, reassurance means you have to recognize that the Russians have legitimate security concerns, which is uh, appeasement now. So you can't even recognize their security concerns, which
Yeah.
means you can't have reassurance, which means that the only instrument in the toolbox is deterrence, which is why we now have building American bases on our soil. We're going to make the Arctic a front line against the Russians. Again, diplomacy, we used to always say in all conflicts, at least start talking. Now, diplomacy is also appeasement and dangerous. Indeed, concessions or even negotiations will be a reward for Putin. So we can't even talk anymore. So I think the reason has gone out the window. I think this is my main concern.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Just one last anecdote that may illuminate this problem very well for all of us. I was privileged to listen in on a phone call that was conducted between Secretary of Defense Bill Perry back in 95 during these talks and senior military advisors. And what he said to them at the time, I was a promotable lieutenant colonel. I hadn't become a full colonel yet. He said to them, look, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. In other words, don't sign a peace agreement of any kind unless it makes sense. Secondly, we don't want any territorial outcome that includes Danzig corridors. In other words, we don't want to go through that again. And then finally, we want nothing that commits American ground forces for more than a few months in the Balkans. I thought Secretary Perry was 100% correct. You don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican to appreciate the intelligence and the viewpoint of a man like that. He was a good Secretary of Defense. Now, unfortunately, he wasn't heeded. And eventually, despite our best efforts to avoid the so-called Danzig corridor business, we ended up with something like that that reaches all the way to Srebrenica, the highway from the Bosniak Republic out to Srebrenica. Be that as it may, we ended up with a permanent fort down there in Kosovo, and we still have a presence, European military presence down in the Balkans. Not much in American terms, but we are stuck in this Camp Bone Steel in Kosovo. So We got to get back to basics. And again, all of this stems from a failure to appreciate our limitations. And that's a huge problem for the United States. If you listen to President Putin, whenever he speaks, it's very clear that he sees limitations to Russian power and capability and interest. This man is not a fool. And he understands that the goal is to end this and get back to building prosperity, commerce. So when you say what is he ultimately going to do, he's already given a great speech about this to all of the economists and industrialists in Russia, and he said, "Forget the West. We can't depend upon anybody there to sober up and behave rationally. So we're going to focus internally, and we're going to focus to the east and the south, and develop our trade relationships there." So he's already sort of written us off as with one foot in the lunatic asylum. And I don't think he's wrong. I think he's right. Problem is there's no one thinking. It's all emotion.